Shalom, welcome to another episode of Inspiration from Zion. I'm Jonathan Feldstein, and I have the privilege of being your host, coming to you from the Judean mountains here in Israel. I like to refer to it as the original Bible Belt. Inspiration from Zion is a program of the Genesis 123 Foundation, whose mission is to build bridges between Jews and Christians with Israel in ways that are new, unique, and meaningful. I pray that you will find this all of those. Through this program, we're excited to connect you to people and stories in and relating to Israel to give you a window to look through, experiencing aspects of life here that you might not otherwise know about. We want this to be interactive, so be in touch with us at inspirationfromzion@gmail.com and send along any questions about any topic anytime. Or you can reach us at genesis123.co or follow and like Inspiration from Zion on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Stay tuned until the end, where we always offer you an exciting opportunity, and please feel free to share this with others who will also find it of interest. Now, so I don't forget, it would be really bad form of me to neglect to mention the Shadchan, the matchmaker of today's conversation, who's a dear mutual friend. Because I don't have her permission to use her name, we will just go by she knows who she is. And for a very long time, she's been trying to get myself together with Gary and with Cindy, with whom I'm pleased that we are together right now. This is a really important topic today, not just the actual current events of who are the terrorists Israel is releasing and why does it matter, but specifically this week, because this week is the week of the anniversary, and I don't like using that word, but the anniversary of the Islamic Revolution 46 years ago that saw the rise of the Islamic regime in Iran, and unfortunately, so many dominoes that fell as a result, and the trauma, the war, the death, the suffering that we've had, not just here in Israel, but in the region and around the world as a result. And that makes this conversation today particularly relevant to current events and relative to what I hope is a future where Gary and Cindy will be out of business, because we will see no more Islamic regime and no more threats of terror. Until that point, let me introduce our guests, our experts today. Gary Osen is the managing partner of Osen LLC, a boutique litigation firm based in New Jersey. He has litigated complex cases, often of international dimensions, throughout his career. Gary served as a lead trial counsel in the landmark Lindy versus Arab Bank PLC case, which resulted in the first and still only jury verdict against a financial institution under the Anti-Terrorism Act in the United States. He's also been lead counsel, or is lead counsel, on several major counterterrorism financing cases that are pending in the U.S. federal courts, involving financing of Hamas through a Jordanian bank, financing Hezbollah through 13 Lebanese banks, and many others. I love this. The Washington Times describes his penchant for tackling larger-than-life cases and developing new and creative theories that challenge some of the world's largest companies and most powerful governments. And the New York Times, not to be outdone by the Washington Times, has recognized him as an internationally consulted legal authority on terror financing. Cindy Schlanger is also a partner at Osen LLC and has been a litigator for more than 2 decades. She supervised the firm's German restitution practice and currently managed many of the firm's terrorism cases brought under the Terrorism Exemption to Foreign Sovereignty Immunity Act. I don't know what that is, but it's got a lot of capital letters and sounds very important. She oversees all phases of litigation, coordinates efforts by local and international co-counsel, and supervises outside investigations. She spearheaded the firm's celebrated, successful legal efforts to recover the Saks poster collection and other looted cultural assets seized by the Nazis during World War II. Gary and Cindy, I'm very, very grateful to our mutual friend for pushing us as a good Jewish mother would, and good Jewish grandmother, and I'm very, very grateful that we're able to make this time for you to join Inspiration from Zion. Welcome.
Thank you.
So I want to jump in, but I'd like to jump in with some background. Background about you, not about me, but it's relevant to me. It's been a long time since my mother was alive and since she was a good Jewish mother, but she always pushed me to become a lawyer. And that may be the one thing or one of the things about which I disappointed her. But when you were younger and you were in law school and then you graduated and you began your legal careers, did you ever think that you were going to be in practice with an expertise suing Arab and Islamic states, banks, and terror organizations? And how on earth did that get started? Ladies first.
Oh, the short answer to that is no. The long, the long answer is a little bit longer, and I think I may defer to Gary on that one, but I don't think we ever um, imagined developing an expertise or even delving into this area of the law. It's when we first started this, it was relatively new. We were amongst the first or the first firm to sue a financial institution for funding terrorism. The inspiration has for this as I think a bit of a longer story, which Gary may want to share in part, but not take up the entire podcast. Um,
Well,
but
Gary, so I would love that. My mother envisioned me not just as a lawyer, but a Supreme Court justice. My name was going to be J.A. Feldstein. Okay, I didn't make that either. But what about you and your mother? And how did you get started in this?
We had a background, as alluded to in your intro. We had done a lot of work in German restitution work, and complex sort of international cases relating to looted art and other issues like that. So we had a background in sort of piecing together um, law firms around the world, tracking things down. We had that sort of call it investigative background and multinational litigation background, but we had no involvement or expertise in terrorism or terrorism financing. But unfortunately, 9/11 in the United States occurred, and one of our neighbors up the block was tragically murdered. He didn't work in the towers, but he was setting up to make a presentation at a technology conference at Windows in the World and came early that morning and was trapped in the building. So that sort of launched our efforts, not intentionally, but in our efforts to help the family and do a variety of other things, which we don't have time for today. But that led to an inquiry by the family as to whether they should join what was then a very new lawsuit brought by the 9/11 victims against various, principally Saudi charities and also some Saudi financial institutions. And in the course of doing sort of just due diligence for that family, we saw that the Saudi funding for Al Qaeda was clandestine. It was very difficult to track for the firms that were working on it. Not that they didn't do a great job, but it's just Al Qaeda was much more controversial in Saudi Arabia because it also had an anti-regime component to it. Whereas support for Hamas and the jihad in Palestine, as they would call it, was pretty much openly encouraged and celebrated. And so you didn't have to, find a guy in a back alley with a microfilm, like in a spy novel. You had advertisements in the newspaper. You had a telethon that was broadcast on Saudi television. So
Really?
yeah,
in April of 2002. So it was so much more in the open that it really um, got us thinking about it. And then a lot of these things you can call them coincidence or fate, whatever it is. But um, I had a I have a friend in Tel Aviv, also originally from New Jersey, and He was introduced to a fellow New Jerseyan who had been badly injured in a terrorist attack in May of 2003. And excuse me, unfortunately, this fellow New Jerseyan was paralyzed from the neck down. And he encouraged me, my friend did, to come with him to visit him in the hospital. And I did, just to pay a visit and so forth, a little
Uh,
encouragement. And when I left and we were thinking about it, and I had this file from the 9/11 context, so all this Hamas fundraising in Saudi Arabia. Well, to make a long story short, one thing led to another, and eventually that turned into Lindy versus Arab Bank.
Got it. Okay. Well, we're gonna get to Lindy versus Arab Bank and also the Iranian case. But you're sadly you're in a growth market, and I alluded in the intro that I hope that you'll be out of business before you can retire. And although I'm ga already gathering that this is not just a business, but a passion and probably something with which you'll never retire, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, or we can have a conversation in 20 years from now. When you were before we get into the cases, how do people today who are victims of terror, how do they reach you, or how do you reach them? How's we are connected through a shidduch. How does that happen?
Um, Cindy could add to this, but I think it's kind of haphazard, for lack of a better term. It's a combination of other lawyers who have a connection to a client or retain somebody, but don't know what to do with. They know the person's been grievously injured, but they don't know how to bring an anti-terrorism act case, so they will refer them to us. And there are also numerous um, individuals and families that just reach out to us. And sometimes they also have met another family in the course of, a victim support group or whatever. So there are a lot of different ways to do it. We're not very good at, nor do we um, actively pursue sort of solicitation of clients. Not that there's anything ethically or otherwise wrong with it, but our focus has always been since the beginning on the sort of evidence collection and building cases more than being a more traditional public, a personal injury firm that tries to get clients. So we get them often in our cases. We'll bring the first case, and then the cases that copy our work have many more clients in them because those firms are sort of more actively collecting the clients. But for us, the main focus is on sort of the hunt for information and evidence that will ultimately make a successful case.
Right. Cindy, do you want to add anything?
I would say that, or just to expand a little bit on what Gary said, about, particularly where we have, unfortunately, because the world of terror victims, and it sort of depends, but unfortunately, many of them meet each other, and we do have, we'll sometimes even now have, we have clients who are injured in the second Intifada, and they connect with October 7th clients, and that's how some
Uh,
to us. We also, we also represent a huge number of U.S. military families, Gold Star families, wounded veterans, and they also have their own interconnected networks. And we will often, we've had many clients who've gotten to us. We have somebody who served with them in Iraq or Afghanistan, and they're still in touch even after their military service. They'll put them in touch with us. So a lot of it is word of mouth, and then sometimes, you know, some of our cases do get press. People will read the articles. They will reach out to us. So it's really a combination of things, but we're not actively uh, banging down doors or, actively soliciting people. Especially, take, for example, October 7th victims, where we know that we do have a case, but we really try to give people their space when they've undergone something so traumatic. And we always tell anybody who meets with us that, the first priority has to be taking care of yourself, taking
Yeah,
care of your family. If you're ready to talk to us, that's fine. And if you're not, we'll be here when you are ready to talk to us.
great. That's very sensitive. I'm curious. We had a conversation last week just to meet each other and kind of frame out what we were going to discuss, and came up with the title, if you will, of this: Who are the terrorists being released and why does it matter? And I think it was Gary, you were giving me a list of names of terrorists that I don't know if you thought I would know, but I felt like you and I were kids in the 1970s talking about the 1969 Mets, being able to rattle off those names. Um, I want to discuss who they are, and there are a lot of questions about that. Why, not to necessarily get into the nature of the deal that's seeing all these terrorists being released, although certainly any comments about that. But what's happening? Who are these terrorists that are being released, and why does that matter?
Well, so far, and again, we're in phase one of what is, at least for the moment, contemplated to be a three-part prisoner for hostage exchange. So we don't know the full list of people who would be released in phase two and three. I would say, broadly speaking, the people who have been released so far, and again, it's a bit of a simplification, but they consist of a large number of actual hands-on murderers, people who, with an axe or a kitchen knife or a gun, physically murdered people. And then a large number of terrorists who I would describe somewhat tongue-in-cheek as like middle management, people who are certainly involved in and actively and some often serving 20 or 30 life sentences for murder because they were part of a terror cell that committed a terrorist attack that often killed many people. But so far, the very most senior leaders of the infrastructure, and I'm not now speaking even of the political leadership like the Marwan Barghoutis of the world, but the folks who really are at the sort of top of the food chain of the terror infrastructure have not yet been released. By and large, it's been sort of their deputies and sort of the participants in planning and executing terrorist attacks, but not the bosses.
Got it. Cindy, are you dealing with it? It's about a little over 2 weeks since this deal started, and we began seeing terrorists released, and before that, names of terrorists and speculation that this one might be on a list or is. Or, what's impact are you seeing among your clients, whether they're current or past, and how they're, I don't know, experiencing this? How is it impacting them?
So we've heard, I think Gary and I collectively have heard from a handful of clients. Some have simply asked us, is the person responsible for my attack? Or is their name on the list? Have they been released? And we don't always have the answer. And we also, could they still be, if they haven't been released, could they still be released? I think my general sense is, and Gary may want to add to that, is that there's tremendous relief for the hostage families. But at the same time, these are people who have experienced and suffered firsthand what these people, I generally more refer to them as monsters, are capable of.
Legal term.
Yeah, yes, it's a very technical legal term.
Yes.
And just in general, I can tell you that for many of our clients, who certainly the clients from the Second Intifada, but even if you look at our clients, our U.S. military families where their loved ones were, injured or killed in Iraq, going back quite a number of years now, more than a decade, Second Intifada, we're talking now 20 plus years. And even if they're not reaching out to us, they are all still very much impacted. It doesn't go away, at least from what we see and what they express to us. They learn, many of them, not all, many of them learn to sort of deal with it, each in their own way, whether they compartmentalize, whether they channel energies elsewhere. But it's certainly, I think for at least some of them, this is, whether it's digging up old wounds or sort of reopening a wound that is, maybe not fully healed because it will never heal. But it's certainly reopening wounds, and I think bringing up, terrible memories, a certain amount of anxiety. And it's mixed with, relief of seeing, the hostages coming out.
Yes. Yeah. I had a conversation with a survivor of a terrorist attack here, who just, even though it's causing her tremendous trauma, she can justify that trauma by seeing the joy in the families of the hostages, and that's a very big way of looking at it. But as you said, Cindy, maybe she's always going to have the trauma. So what's a little bit more, perhaps, is the way of looking at it. I want to talk about the two cases, the Iran case and the Arab Bank case. And I thought it made sense to do Iran first, because Iran's sort of the godfather of all the evil, and we're talking about it in the week of the Iranian Revolution. But from a legal perspective, as the experts, which one sets up the other one better, and which one would you prefer to start with?
We can always start with Iran.
Let's start with Iran. Tell us about that. What is what we're referring to as the Iran case? And you are both what's it called? Co-hosts, so you can share anything that you want on your screen for those watching, and for those not watching and listening, you should subscribe so you can watch these in the future.
So I think maybe Cindy can just briefly explain the terrorism exception to foreign sovereign immunity, since the all capital letters seem to impress you. So
Thank you. For the non-lawyers, to my mother's dismay.
For the non-lawyers, it's a bit of we've reduced it to a bit of an alphabet soup. But so what we commonly refer to as the FSIA, which is the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. So as a general rule, you can't sue a foreign government, you can't sue a sovereign government. Under US law, there are exceptions to that rule. And one of the exceptions is for state sponsors of terrorism. As currently constituted, there are 4 countries on the state sponsor list. That's Iran, Syria, North Korea, and Cuba came off it. It may have been just reinstated, or it's about to be put back on the list. I'm not sure if that executive order was issued yet. And what that means is that we can sue Iran in a US court. Iran does not appear in US courts, but we can sue them. We do actually have to go through a rather lengthy process of serving them with the lawsuits. That means a whole process via registered mail. They always reject service, but occasionally helpfully stamp their rejections with a little stamp saying service refused in English and Farsi. And then we have to go through the process of attempting diplomatic service via the State Department. So just the process of bringing the cases, just bringing one of these cases, it's a year before you can actually really get into the case. And even though Iran doesn't show up for these cases, we are still required to prove our case. Federal judges are not going to sit there and go, oh, you're suing Iran. They're the, root of all evil in the world, which they might be, but they're not going to just go, okay, done. We have to, with every case that we bring, we still, whether it's Iran or Syria or North Korea, who we've sued as well in the past, we have to still show a link and a tie between Iran and the attacks in which our clients were injured or killed. So I think that's maybe the shortest version I can give you of the FSIA.
Okay. Which answered one of my other questions was, do they show up? But that's
Yes,
interesting.
in US courts, they do not show up. When they get sued in other Western countries, like in, let's say, Western Europe, they show
Um,
there in our experience, mainly because they still have assets there. Where here, if they had assets that could be easily attached in the US, I think they would show up.
got it.
Of course, they also would have a problem, I guess, retaining legal counsel in the US because anything that, well, it's actually pretty simple because they're on a sanctions list. In order to hire a law firm in the US, they would actually be required to get a waiver. And Gary can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe they
They
would be
do.
required to get
For
oh,
example, to contest, excuse me, to contest a judgment enforcement, they were able to hire counsel and get a waiver in the U.S. But to Cindy's point, they very rarely appear in a U.S. court, and they appear more regularly in European proceedings.
Got it. Okay. Thank you for that. So now, I mean, we're referring to it as the Iran case, but if we're going, I mean, I don't know how far back this goes. We can go back surely 45 years, maybe 46 if we go to when they took the hostages at the US Embassy. So what's the case? Now that we've established how, what's the case?
So, speaking now, this specific case that you're referring to deals with October 7 victims, American families uh, from the October 7th attacks, and also for dual U.S. Israeli nationals serving in the IDF who've been killed or injured since October 7th. And that case against Iran, I should say at the outset that many law firms, or at least a half dozen, have brought cases against Iran for October 7th on behalf of similarly situated victims. I think what makes our case a little bit different is that um, the threshold for establishing that Iran supports Hamas or Islamic Jihad is not very difficult as a burden because there are many government findings to that effect over the years. Every year, the State Department puts out a Patterns of Global Terrorism report and lists Iran as a sponsor of Hamas, amongst others. So, while it's complicated and service issues abound and it's not easy to do, the cases against Iran are generally pretty straightforward. What we've done is tried to take things another level by integrating into our complaint very detailed allegations, including documentation about Iran's specific support, not just for Hamas, but for the financing and planning of October 7th. And certainly in the first couple of months after October 7th, there was a general effort or view coming out of Washington that while Iran generally supports Hamas, they weren't really involved in the planning of the attack. They didn't have foreknowledge of it and so forth. And even though the Wall Street Journal had some pretty detailed reporting on the Iranian role in the planning, the general view, I think, in the intelligence community, or at least the public-facing view, was that Iran didn't really involve itself in the particulars. And our complaint really tries to track chronologically and with the support of documents that came out of Gaza that were captured by the IDF in the last year to show that they were not only funding specifically October 7th, they had a separate black budget for it.
Really?
They had a separate budget and there are line items. And if you, I'm going to sound like a commercial now, but if you go to our website at www.osenlaw.com and follow the link to October 7th litigation, you can see, clicking on the complaint, we attached exhibits to the complaint that are in fact including line budget items for payments to Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in Gaza, for the black budget, and other correspondence between the late Ismail Haniyeh and the late Yahya Sinwar and the late Marwan Issa. That's my favorite part of saying their names, is the late part of it. But all of these individuals who are the senior leaders of Hamas discussing their various issues, some of them internal difficulties that they were facing. There's a fragmentation or different camps within Hamas, one led by Khalid Mashal, the former senior head of Hamas, who was somewhat displaced by Sinwar. He's based in Qatar. He's still amongst the living, but he and his group are rivals and competitors, if you will, of Sinwar and Haniyeh. The IDF has since taken care of some of that rivalry because Khalid Mashal is still amongst the living. But all of those kind of preparations and the difficulties they had to overcome, and the planning of what we call the double bluff that led to October 7th, all of that is laid out in detail in the complaint. And if you like, I see you noted
Double bluff.
what the double bluff is. So in the months, and actually almost 2 years before October 7th, the Hamas, what they called the Joint Operations Room, which was their coordinated work with Iran and Hezbollah and the other terrorist groups that were under their wing, worked on this project where they simultaneously, repeatedly talked about in very public forums how they were going to launch a major attack. And they had meetings, mostly in Lebanon, but elsewhere as well, where they planned their future attacks in ways that they understood Israeli intelligence would be able to monitor. And so they simultaneously told the public and told Israel, we're going to attack you. But they also fed into the Israeli desire to believe that they were doing their usual bluster. And so when, for example, there'd be rocket attacks by PIJ or other groups, Hamas wouldn't join in, or Israel would hit the rocket launchers or kill a local Islamic Jihad leader or whatever, and Hamas would not retaliate. So the Israelis became convinced that all of these planning sessions and all these movements of people were all part of their kind of face-saving internal consumption plans. And in fact, what they really were was deterred by Israeli strikes in May 21 and a desire to really focus on economic development and the like. And so they could plan in the open through a double bluff. They could have all these maneuvers. They could practice in ways that the Israeli intelligence services could see, but they would interpret them in the wrong way, of course, until October 8th.
Got it. Wow, that's very fascinating. And you mentioned May of 21. Of course, that battle, conflict, war was 10 days when they started firing rockets because our feet were on the Temple Mount. But ironically, and I don't know if you were here for that, but that began the opening shots literally began during the wedding of our mutual friend's daughter. And as we were in the middle of praying mincha before the afternoon prayer before the actual wedding ceremony, is when rockets started landing probably 2-3 miles to the north of us. That was crazy.
And so the planning of October 7th really started right after the Operation Guardians of the Wall.
Got it.
And what the Israelis concluded from it was that the operation had been successful and that Hamas was deterred, and that they were focused on economic development and governance and so forth,
Well,
despite their public and repeated statements that they were going to murder everyone.
sure.
Um,
And presumably now, and that won't be allowed to happen anymore, even at the risk of calling up reserves or preemptive attacks or something else, because we made that mistake already. That this double bluff.
I would say never is a long time.
Okay.
And in October of 1973, the IDF also thought it wasn't necessary to fully mobilize because it was probably a training exercise.
Right.
It is common, I think, not just for Israel, but Israel has a much um, shorter margin for error. But I
Yeah.
think it's a common problem of Western democracies that want peace, that want to live good life and so forth, to put themselves to sleep
Well,
and convince themselves that others feel as they do.
right. Well said. I mean, that general sociological observation can be said in many, many different ways. But that's unfortunately correct, and never is a long time. Hopefully not in our lifetime again. Um, okay. So the Iran case is dealing with October 7th specifically. That means it's all relatively new. Just give where does it stand, and what do we need to look at going ahead? How long will this litigation be protracted?
Well,
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 that's- uh, you were gonna get an answer, probably the same one either way, but um, we will be amending our complaint and adding new and additional allegations as we learn more and get more
okay.
materials, probably in the next month or so. Um, and then we go through the long process that Cindy discussed of serving the complaint
Uh,
and going through all that. It takes about 3 years, um, round trip, sometimes longer, depending on the court and its docket, to ultimately present the evidence. But for us, the main thrust, other than obviously getting the judgment for our clients, is to really um, sort of add to the historical record and provide concrete information to better understand how this came about and what specifically in this case Iran's role was in facilitating the attacks
got it.
themselves.
Got it. Okay, well, then we will look forward to updates and a celebratory success in the not too distant future. Unless there's something else that we need to know about that, the Arab bank case was revolutionary, a precedent setting. Tell us about that.
I'll start and then maybe we'll put up a couple of slides with your permission, and Cindy can add to it. I think going back to what I said earlier about the Saudi support for Hamas back in the Second Intifada period being very open and public. I mentioned that there were newspaper articles and there was a telethon on Saudi television. And so when you would look at the website back then of the Saudi Committee for the Support of the Intifada al-Quds, that was a mouthful, but that was the name of the organization that was created to support the Intifada. They not only published lists of martyrs and prisoners and so forth that they were paying, but they also, on their website, identified Arab Bank of Jordan, which at
Ah,
the time was the largest bank in the Palestinian territories. It had the most branches in Gaza and the West Bank. And so they identified it as the place where the money was being distributed. And local newspapers in the Palestinian territories would print advertisements directing people with lists of names to go to their local branch of the bank to collect their money.
wow.
So that's how we started with it, with the Saudi committee payments, because they were largely over the counter in cash. If you were the parent of a suicide bomber and you were on the list, you could go into your local branch in Jenin or Ramallah,
Wow.
show your photo ID, and then get $5,316 in cash. And to put it in perspective, in terms of purchasing power in 2002 and the Palestinian territories, that'd be the equivalent of someone in your audience getting $50,000 or more in cash. Um, so that process obviously suggested a very strong degree of coordination and collaboration by the bank. And and so that's how the case started. And of course, over the years, we sued our bank in July of 2004. And at the time, they enjoyed the highest regulatory rating from the Office of the Control of the Currency, the US regulator at the Treasury. Within 5 months of suing them, their New York branch was closed by the Treasury. They paid a $24 million fine, and they agreed that they would no longer clear US dollars through their own branch. They would find someone else to do it. So it took another 10 years before we got to trial. And then
Wow.
at trial, a jury found our bank liable for 24 Hamas attacks committed during the Second Intifada. And I won't go into all the evidence and all the other material, but if I can manage the technological achievement of sharing a
Yeah.
screen, I'll do that now and see if this works.
Yeah, I had a glance at these, and this is also where it gets into the kind of who's who, some of the names that you mentioned, I think, of the terrorists being released. But you please narrate this.
Right. So, first of all, this just shows the 24 attacks that were involved in that trial. And, they range from 2001 to 2004. And as you can see, all over Israel at that point in time, anyone who lives in Israel knows and is old enough remembers there were attacks and bombings literally every day
Yeah.
during that period of time. And
Wait, if
so,
I can interject, I'm just
sure.
looking at this myself. The one, because it's long name and it has two lines, the Hebrew University cafeteria bombing in Jerusalem, the terrorist responsible for that is on the list now to go out. Yeah,
Yes, at least one of the major um, planners and perpetrators was released,
was released. Okay.
and we'll touch upon that in a
Okay.
moment.
Go ahead.
So, for purposes of our trial, this is just to demonstrate that this we would collect, amongst other things, the forensic reports from the police and otherwise to show you. Of course, you can see from the image that this is an older computer now, going back in time, but this is the kind of sophistication of packing a computer with explosives and nails and nuts and bolts. For we forget because we lived through it, but um, for many of the younger generation, this phenomenon of suicide bombers packing um, nails and bolts with their suicide vests and their devices to maximize the pain and suffering of the victims in the blast radius. Often the nails or the bolts were soaked in rat poisoning and other things to enhance the likelihood of infection and so forth. So this is an incredibly sadistic weapon delivery system, and in its own way comparable to the sadism of October 7th. So here we're talking about, this is how we mapped it out for the jury. This is the sort of particular cell that was involved in the Cafe Moment bombing and many others. And the Cafe Moment, by the way, which no longer has that name, is right across the street from the Prime Minister's residence in Jerusalem. The person who's been released is Wael Qassem. And if you'll recall, I mentioned at the beginning that so far the people who've been released are sort of middle management. So the two names, or actually three names here that have not yet been released, but are harbingers of sort of the worst that can happen, are Ibrahim Hamid, who ran the Qassam Brigades, Hamas's terror infrastructure in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria. He's in prison, and he was the sort of running the show. Abdullah Barghouti, underneath his image, was one of the most prolific bomb makers of the Second Intifada. And again, releasing someone like Abdullah Barghouti, you're releasing a not just the man, but all the technological know-how of bomb making that goes
And
with
he's
it.
on a list. He's on a list to be received, if I'm not mistaken. Yes.
So he has not been released, and there's no indication yet that he will be.
Okay.
But he's the kind of individual who is even more dangerous than a murderer who stabbed someone with a knife and so on. They might be more psychotic, if you will, but someone like Barghouti, who has engineering training and so forth, just presents a different level of risk. And then you'll see that the same group was responsible for terrible, they're all terrible, but a particularly devastating bombing at a nightclub in Rishon LeZion in 2002. This is just an example of Hamas's taking credit for and issuing public acknowledgments of their role in these attacks. That same cell was responsible for Hebrew University, the Frank Sinatra cafeteria bombing.
Got it.
Again, the same bomb maker, the same Wael Qassem, and this infrastructure killed not just hundreds of people, but it killed a substantial number of American citizens. Right. And those family members are our clients. So, we've lived with it for 20 years, not, thank God, in the way that the families live with it every day, but it's sort of part of the fabric of our lives because we had to prove that Hamas committed the attack and that the bank was responsible. And again, I mentioned to you earlier that my first encounter with this was with a relatively young man who was paralyzed from the neck down in a terrorist attack from New Jersey. One of the people responsible for his injuries and eventual death was also released. And again, many Americans were amongst the injured and dead in the August 19th bombing in 2003. This was a bus going from the Kotel with a lot of Haredi passengers with small children, and many small children were murdered by this group. And unfortunately, one of the cell members was released as part of the exchange for the hostages. And then lastly, this is Cafe Hillel, which was in Jerusalem, and many Americans, the American Anglo community, know that amongst the casualties in this attack were Nava Applebaum, a young lady who was going to be married the next day
Yeah.
and went to the cafe with her dad the night before, and there's the wrong time in the wrong place. And again, this attack ultimately engineered by Abraham Mohammed, and it is the Ubaid brothers who were released. So this is sort of the sort of bittersweet aspect of it for us. Obviously, like most people, we rejoice in the release of the hostages, um, and it's heartwarming to see, every scene of a hostage, whether it's the young ladies or the Thai workers. You just feel a special sense of relief for each of them. But of course, the price that's paid is that these killers and bomb makers and so forth are set back into the world.
And the families that they victimized are no doubt, as you said at the beginning, Cindy, the trauma that may never close all the way. The scars certainly is ripped open somewhat more. Cindy, is there anything you want to thank? First of all, thank you for that, Gary. Is it okay? I'm assuming people are mesmerized, unfortunately, by the who's who list of those masterminds. If people want to see that, may I share that with people if they reach out? Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, good. Thank you. Cindy, anything to add to what Gary said before we kind of move on? I want to also begin to wrap up.
Of course, I think Gary pretty much covered it all. I don't think I can add a lot to it. Just as Gary mentioned before, these lists come out and people see names. These lists come out and we go, oh my God, it's so and so from such and such attack who've
Yeah,
been injured. So these people, because like the names are sort of burned into our brains after 20 years of seeing them over and over and over again.
right. Got it. What I like to do, begin to wrap up on a macro basis and then very micro. Um, Something is when you were speaking, I think Gary, when you were speaking before, uh, we're shocking to, I mean, not shocking, but shocking that the Saudis had a telethon in 2002 to raise money for Hamas. Tremendous. Interestingly enough, I didn't know about that. It was a month after the Saudis issued, or less than a month after the Saudis issued their peace plan. A little bit of a contradiction, but okay. But now today, from New Jersey. I was from New Jersey. The 9/11 and everything that I was there, trauma, not in New York, but in New Jersey. Remember that and the cloud and everything that goes with us. And that was all Saudi fingerprints. But we're in a very different world now. The Saudis seem like they're the key to peace, and that they have turned a big corner. And I'm wondering if maybe you can help people who are listening understand, where does all this fit in now into the Middle East and U.S.-Israel relations? You obviously have a really important role on a legal perspective, but you also see the bigger picture. And I love if you can be a pundit and give any additional thoughts you might.
Well, I think a couple of different factors have contributed to um, where we are today. One of them is that both the Saudis, the Emiratis, and um, Bahrain, I'll throw in there as well as to some extent the Egyptian government too, came to recognize that the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the parent organization of Hamas, and which operates throughout the world, including the United States, um, was a danger not just to Israel, but to them, because it's fundamentally a revolutionary movement
Right.
that intends to overthrow the status quo. And if you're the Saudi regime or the Emiratis, you are the status quo. So over time, they came to view these um, radical initiatives, and particularly the Muslim Brotherhood, as dangerous, not a danger just to the West, but a danger to them. So that was one factor. And the other was really the Iran nuclear deal. The Obama administration's commitment to the Iran nuclear deal, which I think most of the Sunni Arab world saw as a abandonment of the, or at least a downgrading of the U.S. alliance with its traditional um, uh, regional allies and Saudi Arabia in particular. Given that Iran is sort of a natural competitor, if not enemy, of Saudi Arabia, it actually had the effect of, at least in a indirect way, pushing the Sunni states closer to Israel,
Right.
because they shared a common concern with Iran, and the main protector of the Sunni states against this Iranian aggressive adventurism was the United States. And to the extent that the Obama administration was signaling its retreat from the region and it's trying to cooperate with the Iranians, well, the only army left in the Middle East that could conventionally and non-conventionally challenge Iran was Israel. So that has led to, in the first Trump administration, to the Abraham Accords, and it has led to all kinds of realignments and strange bedfellows in the Middle East, as different constituencies kind of battle one another, under the radar. So it would take hours and hours to explain, and I couldn't do half of it, but suffice to say that it's a very complex environment that everyone's navigating.
It's a good explanation. Knowing with the scars that we carry of 9/11, just being there and you losing somebody who was close to you, and it's not that long ago. It's a generation. Do you see a generation ahead where we can have a U-turn vis-a-vis Iran, or are we just going to keep having to sue them and fight against them? Cindy, go ahead. You want to?
I was gonna say, I mean, I think a lot of that largely depends on what happens with the current Iranian regime, and Gary may have a different take on this, but um, even though I don't think it's widely reported here, at least from what we see, the regime is wildly unpopular with the Iranian people. Occasionally things leak out of Iran, where, you'll see people in soccer stadiums or at other events where, they'll dump an American flag or an Israeli flag on the floor for people to step on. Instead, they step around it. They'll chant, death to the mullahs at a soccer event. I mean, they will take to the streets also. So I think if there is regime change in Iran, then we could be looking at a different country. And again, this is my opinion. I
Okay.
don't, thoroughly just from, what we see, what we come across in our work. I think there are large parts of the Iranian people, I think more than the vast majority, would like to see regime change. And you also hear about complaints from the Iranian people about, the Iranian economy is not doing well, and I think it's about to
Yeah.
do a lot worse. They're not really interested in what resources that trickle down to the people there. They're not really interested in their resources going to fund Hamas or other terror groups. So, from my sort of non-expert eye, I think a lot of it is gonna depend on if we can, when I say we, if depending what comes out of the current administration, if there's, if sanctions, maximum pressure is applied, will we finally see a change in the regime in Iran?
Okay. Well, qualify modestly that you're not an expert. You have great expertise that other people don't have. So it's a really good input, and I'm grateful for that. Gary, anything you want to add to that?
I would just say that in general, one of the main challenges in the Middle East, um, especially from an American perspective, an American policymaker perspective, is to see the world as it is and
Ah,
not as you wish it to be. And I think it's always dangerous to categorize any of these governments or states from a vantage point of an American, Federalist Papers kind of perspective. Um, these are regimes that survive in an incredibly hostile environment and ever-shifting alliances and dangers. And again, to navigate that from an American standpoint means seeing the world as it is. And just to sort of give a practical example to conclude, we heard a lot of talk right after October 7th about a revitalized Palestinian Authority.
yeah,
Um, in my view, that's not a reflection of reality. The Palestinian Authority is headed by an 85-year-old
I think he's even older than
Mahmoud Abbas, or he's at least 85,
that. That's what it.
and he's serving like year 20 of his 4-year term.
yeah.
So reality should be the first principle for
Excellent.
everybody.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. That's a great summary of this whole conversation. But now I'd like to get personal. Lawyers don't have a great reputation. There are a lot of great lawyer jokes. Lawyers can be real jerks and go home and play with the kids and have a glass of wine and as if nothing took place and then go back to the grind the next day. Obviously, that's a generalization. Having said that, you're not jerks. You're doing something that's sacred. That's essential for people and as I think a critical shot, critical front in the war on terror. You can't not take this home with you. It can't not impact you on a personal basis. The things that you do, the things that you're exposed to. Would you share, assuming I'm right, how that is the case? Go ahead, Cindy.
I'm trying to think about the best way to answer that. I mean,
Honestly.
is we are extremely invested in these cases. These are not 9 to 5 cases, 5 days a week, especially when you represent families for a decade or 2 decades. You get to really know them. And that, in all aspects of their lives, um, we see uh, clients who are children who survived attacks, and we see them as they grow up and maybe get married and manage to rebuild their lives. We see now we've got U.S. military families where we have fathers and husbands that were killed in Iraq, and their own children are now old enough to serve, and many of them are serving in the U.S. military. And much to the sort of uh, pride, but yet, like everybody else, their mothers also are, up worrying about them. So I would say that there's definitely a very personal aspect to this because of the nature of the cases, because of how well we get to know our clients. So it certainly has an impact. I don't know if I can sort of quantify the impact, but we sort of live and breathe these cases. Like maybe that's the best answer I can give. And so, yeah, they're kind of always with us.
Yeah.
People always joke that, I don't know how to take a vacation or take a break. Um, that's probably because it's really very hard at the end of the day to entirely separate from what we do on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. Gary, you mentioned at the outset or earlier that 9/11 obviously had a major impact, meeting this man in New Jersey who was paralyzed from a terror attack here. And you shared a little bit about which one that was and what happened. How do you or do you not take this home with you?
Um, I I would say that I think about it when I'm awake, and I dream about it when I'm asleep. Um, and I try to. I have a little sort of personal custom of mine, which kind of I think encapsulates this, which is that every time I go to court for an oral argument, lawyers usually bring a binder with them with the cases and their notes and so forth. I always make sure that I have a binder that has one of those plastic sleeves at the front. And I always put a picture of one of the families I represent on that front cover. So I'm reminded before I make some technical argument or whatever that I'm actually representing specific people with their own lives and stories, and that I think you would say in Israel, I'm their shaliach, I'm their representative for them at that moment. So it's all personal.
Thank you. In the interest of time, and you have probably more cases to work on, I want to wrap up, and I've invited a friend from Canada, Lynn Lavender, to join us. And before I just close out with our final remarks, as we do at the end of the program, Lynn, I would love it if you want to make any comments, but certainly close in prayer, and we need some prayer.
Thank you, Jonathan, for asking me. I'm just absolutely sitting here in, I don't know if the word is shock, when you start to see the faces of the terrorists and understanding and even understanding isn't the right word, the sheer trauma of what the victims have gone through and their families, and how do you begin to pray for these people. And I've worked in the legal field myself, but not in the area of litigation. And it is, I thought about the safety of the lawyers within your firm and yourselves, advocating for these victims and coming against these powerful organizations and countries. And yeah, how do you separate your work life from your personal life when the things that you see? I know, having been married to a police officer, just separating themselves from the day-to-day challenges of that. And this is just far more hard to comprehend. So I have such great respect for both of you and all that you're doing for these victims. And the Lord has certainly appointed you to these positions, because it takes a very, very strong and determined individual to keep proceeding and doing what you're doing. So I want to say thank you so much, because you're not only advocating for the victims, I feel that you're advocating for every person in the world who has come against an attack. And the world certainly needs to open up its eyes as to what's going on in the Middle East.
Well said. I'd like to close us in prayer before I make my announcements.
Sure. So, Father, we thank you so much for Jonathan and for the alignment with Cindy and Gary today. We thank you for all that they've shared. Father, first and foremost, I ask that your hand of protection would be over them and their families, over their organizations, over their law firms, over all those who come in alignment with them to fight this terrible evil that we cannot even begin to understand. Father, we ask that you would make a way for them to bring justice into this world, because you are a God of justice. And we ask that each victim who has lived through this terrible horror would just be comforted in our human mindset. We don't know how that's possible, but we know that nothing is impossible with you. And Lord, we just pray and we ask that your hand of protection would be over all of Israel, in the land, and those who are in the diaspora. As we see anti-Semitism rising up around the world, we ask that you would protect your people, and that you would bring people to come alongside them and to support them. Father, we cry out for mercy and for justice in this situation, beyond which we could ever think or imagine. I am just really so without words. We pray for the hostages, that they would be released safely, each and every one of them, that they would be, and when I say safely, we see the atrocities of how they've been released and swarmed by the terrorists, that they would all make it back to Israel alive, Father. Our hope is in you. So, Lord, remove the rose-colored glasses from the eyes of everyone in the world to see what evil is and call evil evil, and to stand up for righteousness and for justice. I ask all this in Yeshua's name. Amen.
Thank you, Lynn. It seems trite to wrap up just with announcements. I will comment though that people are already texting me what a great program. And I know it is because 90% of the people who started with us are still here. So Cindy and Gary, thank you for joining us. Lynn, thank you. I'm glad you weren't busy with other things and could do this with us today.
Thank you,
As
Jonathan.
we always have for the last number of years, we end the program with the Genesis 123 Foundation offering a special gift. We call it From Jonathan's Bookshelf. And since just before the war began, when we came out with our own book, Israel the Miracle, we've been offering that as a free gift. It's a $75 book, stunning book. And I don't remember, Lynn, if we've talked about it, but you and I initially connected through art. And this is an artistic and spiritual masterpiece. So all we ask that you do is like, comment, or share the link to this program. And every month we pick somebody at random who's done so to receive a free copy of the book. We're always grateful that this podcast is sponsored by our friends at the Willow Run Greenhouse in Culpeper, Virginia. And I don't know if anyone's done it yet, but if you're in the area, pop in and thank them for helping make conversations like this possible. And special thanks, as always, to the Coyne family, one of whom is represented here or was represented here a little while ago, for making conversations like this possible. Inspiration from Zion and all of the Genesis 123 Foundation programs are made possible by donations. So please consider joining us to continue the dialogue and build bridges. And if you'd like to sponsor a future episode in honor or memory of a loved one or special occasion, or your favorite trial attorneys who are changing the world, please be in touch at inspirationfromzion@gmail.com. We love to hear your comments, always as part of a dialogue, and invite you to send questions as well, especially questions you have about traditional Judaism for our Ask the Rabbi programs. Wherever you are in the world, I pray that you and your loved ones are safe and healthy, and I send my blessings from right here in the Judean mountains. God bless you.